The morning was clear, and the streets of Brookhaven were just starting to come alive. On a quiet residential block, cars lined the sidewalks, kids played basketball in driveways, and the hum of lawnmowers filled the air. It was the kind of neighborhood where neighbors waved, and life carried on without much incident. But for Officer Rick Carter, this was another routine patrol, a chance to keep the peace, or so he thought. Officer Carter, a veteran of the Brookhaven Police Department, was nearing the end of his shift when his radio crackled to life. Unit 14, report of a suspicious vehicle on Pinewood Drive. Without hesitation, Rick made a turn down Pinewood, scanning the tidy homes and trimmed hedges as he drove. His eyes quickly locked onto a black sedan idling at a stop sign longer than it should. The driver, a middle-aged black man, appeared focused on something in his passenger seat. Rick flipped on his lights and pulled up behind the car. The man in the car was Daniel Thomas, a father of two and a lifelong resident of Brookhaven. Daniel was on his way to pick up a few supplies for his son's birthday party later that evening. In the passenger seat was a grocery list scrawled on a scrap of paper next to a box of unopened decorations. But to Officer Carter, Daniel's prolonged stop seemed unusual. He tapped on his computer to run the plates. Nothing came up, clean registration, no warrants. Still, Carter decided to proceed. He stepped out of the cruiser, adjusted his belt, and approached the driver's side window. "Good morning, sir." "License and registration," Carter said in a tone that carried authority. Daniel reached into his glove box, pulling out the requested documents. "Was there a problem, officer?" Daniel asked. His voice was polite, careful, measured. Carter didn't answer immediately. He scanned the documents, glanced at Daniel, and then took a step back, eyes darting around the car's interior. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he finally asked. It was a question Daniel didn't expect, and for a moment, he hesitated. "I live here," Daniel replied calmly. "I was just heading to the store." Carter nodded but didn't move. Something about his silence hung in the air, heavy and unspoken. Seconds felt like minutes as Carter took another look around the car. "Step out of the vehicle," he said, his tone sharpening. Daniel's heart raced. "What's this about?" he asked, keeping his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through his chest. "Sir, step out of the vehicle," Carter repeated, his voice louder this time. Daniel hesitated but complied, unbuckling his seatbelt and opening the door. Daniel stood on the sidewalk as Carter began a detailed search of the car. He checked the glove box, under the seats, and even the trunk. As the minutes ticked by, Daniel could feel the stares of onlookers growing more intense. His mind raced. What was Carter looking for? What had he done to deserve this level of scrutiny? When Carter found nothing in the car, his demeanor didn't soften. Instead, he turned his attention back to Daniel. "What aren't you telling me?" Carter asked. The question, laced with suspicion, hung in the air as Daniel shook his head, bewildered. "I've told you everything," he replied. "There's nothing else to say." But Carter wasn't convinced, and by now, neither were the neighbors watching from a distance. Phones were out, cameras rolling. Someone in the crowd muttered, "What's going on here?" Another chimed in, "This doesn't look right." What began as a routine stop had now turned into a public spectacle. For Daniel, the situation was becoming unbearable. And for Carter, the weight of his decisions was about to grow heavier than he ever anticipated. The murmurs from the growing crowd began to cut through his focus, and the sound of phones recording didn't help. He felt his authority slipping. He looked at Daniel, standing quietly by the sidewalk, his hands visible, his face calm but undeniably frustrated. Carter couldn't shake the feeling that he had to assert control, even if he wasn't entirely sure why. "Turn around and put your hands on your head," Carter ordered. The words hit like a hammer, cutting through the rising tension in the air. Daniel looked up, his face a mix of disbelief and restraint. "Why?" Daniel asked, his voice steady but firm. "I haven't done anything wrong." Carter took a step forward, his hand hovering near his belt. "Do it now," he barked louder this time. The crowd gasped audibly, and a voice from somewhere in the back called out, "Leave him alone. He didn't do anything." For a moment, time seemed to stop. Daniel glanced at the crowd, at the cameras pointed his way, then back at Carter. Slowly, he complied, turning and interlocking his fingers behind his head. He stood there, the picture of compliance, while Carter reached for his radio to call for backup. As Carter relayed his position and requested assistance, the tension on the sidewalk boiled over. "This isn't right," someone shouted. Another voice chimed in, "You're just targeting him because he's black." Carter's jaw tightened, his grip on the radio firm. He ignored the voices, but the weight of their accusations pressed on him. Minutes later, the faint wail of sirens pierced the air, growing louder with every passing second. 2 additional squad cars pulled up, lights flashing. Officers stepped out, scanning the scene. One of them, Sergeant Laura Mitchell, approached Carter quickly. She was older, with decades of experience, and her expression was sharp as she assessed the situation. "What's going on here?" Mitchell asked, her tone brisk. Carter hesitated, his eyes darting to Daniel, who still stood motionless by the curb. "Suspicious behavior," Carter replied, his words clipped. "I ran his plates, they're clean, but something feels off." Mitchell's gaze shifted to Daniel. Her expression softened slightly as she noticed his calm demeanor and the absence of any visible threat. "Did you find anything in the car?" she asked. Carter shook his head. "Not yet, but," he trailed off, realizing how thin his reasoning sounded under Mitchell's scrutiny. Mitchell stepped closer to Daniel, her voice lowering. "Sir, can you tell me what's going on?" she asked, her tone more measured. Daniel turned his head slightly, his voice steady but laced with frustration. "I told him everything. I was on my way to pick up supplies for my son's birthday party." "That's it." The sergeant nodded, then turned back to Carter. "You searched the car?" she asked again, her tone now sharper. Carter nodded. "Thoroughly." Mitchell's expression grew stern. "Then why is he in this position?" The question hit Carter harder than the crowd's jeers. He stammered, "It's protocol." Meanwhile, in the background, the crowd grew louder, emboldened by the arrival of additional officers. "This isn't protocol," someone shouted. "It's harassment." Another voice added, "We've got it all on video." The officers exchanged uneasy glances as Mitchell sighed heavily, signaling for Carter to step aside. As she released Daniel from the humiliating stance, she spoke quietly to him. "You're free to go," she said. But Daniel didn't move. Instead, he looked at her directly. "Is that it?" he asked. "I get humiliated in front of my neighbors. For what? So he can feel like he's in charge?" His words hung heavy in the air, silencing even the crowd. Mitchell turned back to Carter, her frustration barely hidden. "We'll talk about this later," she said curtly, before motioning for the other officers to disperse. Carter's face flushed as he avoided the eyes of the crowd. But even as the scene began to calm, the damage was done. Unbeknownst to the officers, the videos taken by onlookers were already making their way to social media. Within minutes, hashtags like #BrookhavenBias and #JusticeForDaniel began trending. What had started as a routine stop was quickly becoming a national story. By the end of the day, the video captured by a neighbor had been shared thousands of times. News outlets began picking it up, framing it as yet another example of racial bias in policing. For Daniel, the ordeal wasn't just an incident. It was a storm that would upend his life in ways he never expected. The first sign of this storm came just hours after Daniel returned home. His phone wouldn't stop buzzing. Friends, family, even strangers, all reaching out to show their support or to express outrage at what they'd seen online. "You good, man?" one friend texted. Another message read, "Saw what happened. I'm furious for you." Daniel tried to keep up, but with every new notification, the weight of the situation grew heavier. Meanwhile, back at the precinct, Officer Carter was called into an emergency meeting with his superior officers. The video had reached the chief of police, who was visibly unsettled as he replayed the footage on a loop. Carter sat stiffly in the chair opposite the chief's desk, his usual confidence shaken. "What were you thinking, Rick?" the chief asked, his tone sharp but controlled. Carter tried to defend himself. "It looked suspicious, Chief. He was just sitting there at the stop sign. I was following protocol." The chief leaned forward, pausing the video on a frame where Daniel stood on the curb, hands on his head, surrounded by officers. "This doesn't look like protocol to me," he said. "It looks like you overstepped." Carter opened his mouth to respond but hesitated. He could feel the chief's eyes bearing down on him, and for the first time in years, he felt uncertain about his actions. "We're launching an internal investigation," the chief continued. "You're on administrative leave until we figure this out." The words hit Carter harder than he expected. Administrative leave? In his mind, he hadn't done anything wrong. But as he walked out of the chief's office, he caught sight of a group of his colleagues, huddled together, whispering. The look they gave him wasn't one of solidarity, it was judgment. By the next morning, the story had reached national news. Anchors discussed it on morning shows, panelists debated the implications, and hashtags related to the incident continued to dominate social media. Daniel's name became a trending topic, and his image, a still frame of him standing on the sidewalk, arms raised, was plastered across screens everywhere. Daniel, however, didn't feel like a celebrity. The attention brought with it an overwhelming mix of emotions. Support flooded in from strangers who saw him as a symbol of resilience. But there was also a darker side. Hate mail, accusations of playing the victim, and anonymous threats. "I just want to be left alone," Daniel told his wife one evening as they sat in their living room. Their 2 kids playing in the next room. But it was too late for that. The world had already decided that Daniel's story wasn't just his own. It was a reflection of a larger issue, one that demanded attention. While Daniel grappled with his newfound spotlight, others began digging deeper into Carter's past. Local activists uncovered a troubling pattern: complaints of racial bias, disproportionate stops in predominantly black neighborhoods, and a handful of formal grievances that had quietly been dismissed. As these revelations came to light, public outcry grew louder. One of the voices in the growing movement was a local community leader, Angela Brooks. "This isn't about one officer," she said during a rally that drew hundreds to the steps of the Brookhaven Police Department. "This is about a system that allows this kind of behavior to go unchecked. And we're here to say enough is enough." For Carter, the pressure was unbearable. As the days passed, he found himself avoiding the news, avoiding his phone, and even avoiding his family. "You didn't mean for this to happen," his wife tried to reassure him one evening. "They're just blowing it out of proportion." But Carter couldn't shake the growing sense of doubt gnawing at him. Had he been wrong? The turning point came when Carter received an unexpected call. It was from the chief, asking him to come to the precinct for a meeting. Carter assumed it was related to the investigation, but when he arrived, he found himself face to face with Daniel. The meeting was mediated by Sergeant Mitchell, who had been quietly advocating for a resolution that didn't involve further escalation. "We need to have a conversation," she told them. Daniel sat across from Carter, his expression calm but resolute. Carter, on the other hand, struggled to meet his gaze. "I don't understand why you targeted me," Daniel began, his voice steady but charged with emotion. "I wasn't doing anything wrong. I wasn't a threat. So why?" Carter opened his mouth to respond but found himself at a loss for words. The justifications he had clung to so tightly now felt hollow. I don't know," he finally admitted. "I thought I was doing my job." Daniel's eyes narrowed. "Your job is to protect and serve," he said, "not to humiliate people who look like me." The room fell silent. Even Mitchell seemed at a loss for how to proceed. It was in that silence that Carter began to reflect, not just on the incident, but on his entire career. The complaints, the subtle biases he had ignored, the unexamined assumptions he carried. It all came crashing down. For the first time, he saw himself not as the enforcer of the law, but as a man who had caused harm. This moment wasn't just about Daniel or Carter anymore. It was about the broader question of accountability and whether people, officers, citizens, and systems could truly change when confronted with their own flaws. But accountability, as Daniel and Carter were about to learn, is rarely a straightforward path. In the days following their tense meeting, Brookhaven became a focal point for a growing national conversation about policing and racial bias. Protests filled the streets, with signs bearing Daniel's name and phrases like "Justice Now" and "End Bias." Local leaders scrambled to respond, and the city council held an emergency meeting to address the uproar. For Daniel, the attention was both validating and overwhelming. "I just want my life back," Daniel said during a local news interview. His voice was calm, but his eyes betrayed the weariness of a man who had been thrust into the spotlight. This isn't about me being a hero or a victim. It's about making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else. But for Carter, the fallout was more personal. The internal investigation into his actions unearthed more than just the incident with Daniel. Old complaints from the community were brought to light, painting a picture of a man whose enforcement of the law often came with unchecked bias. Public opinion quickly turned against him, and even within the precinct, support was scarce. "It's like I'm toxic now," Carter confided to a former partner over the phone. "Nobody wants to be associated with me." His partner was silent for a moment before replying, "Maybe it's time to rethink things, Rick. You can't just keep blaming everyone else." Meanwhile, Daniel began working with Angela Brooks and other community leaders to push for systemic change. Together, they drafted a list of demands, including mandatory bias training for officers, the establishment of a civilian oversight board, and greater transparency in policing practices. Their efforts gained traction, and soon, Brookhaven's mayor announced a task force to address these issues. But not everyone was on board. Opposition to the reforms came from both within the police department and segments of the community. "We can't tie the hands of our officers," one resident argued during a heated town hall. "They're out there risking their lives every day." Others, however, countered, pointing to Daniel's case as evidence that reform was long overdue. As the town grappled with these debates, Carter found himself at a crossroads. His administrative leave was extended, and he was ordered to attend bias training as part of his potential reinstatement. The sessions were uncomfortable, forcing Carter to confront not just his actions but the attitudes he had harbored for years. "I didn't think I was the problem," Carter admitted to the instructor one day. "I thought I was just doing my job." The instructor, a retired officer, nodded knowingly. "That's the thing about bias. It's invisible until you look for it. The question is, what are you going to do about it now that you see it?" For Daniel, the fight for justice was far from over. He continued to attend rallies and town hall meetings, sharing his story and calling for change. But the personal toll was undeniable. His children asked questions he struggled to answer, and his wife often worried about the safety of their family as threats continued to arrive. "We're doing the right thing," Daniel told her one evening as they sat together after putting the kids to bed. "It's hard, but it's worth it." She nodded, though her expression remained uneasy. "I just want this to end," she said softly. "For us, for everyone." The turning point in the fallout came when Brookhaven's police chief held a press conference to address the findings of the investigation. Standing at the podium, flanked by city officials, the chief's tone was serious. "We have reviewed the incident involving Officer Rick Carter and Mr. Daniel Thomas," the chief began. "Our findings confirm that Officer Carter's actions were inappropriate and inconsistent with our department's policies and values. Effective immediately, Officer Carter has been terminated from his position." The announcement sent shockwaves through the community. For some, it was a victory, a sign that accountability was possible. For others, it was a reminder of how deeply broken the system remained. Carter, for his part, didn't contest the decision. "I deserve this," he told a friend. "I need to figure out who I am outside of that badge." As Brookhaven began to implement some of the proposed reforms, Daniel reflected on the journey that had brought him to this moment. He spoke at the town's first civilian oversight meeting, addressing a packed room with a mix of hope and determination. "This isn't the end," he said. "It's a start. We still have a long way to go, but if we're willing to listen, to learn, and to hold ourselves accountable, then maybe we can build something better." The room erupted in applause, but Daniel knew the work was far from over. As the meeting ended, he shook hands with community leaders, exchanged contact information with activists, and even spoke briefly with a few officers who had attended to listen and learn. It was a moment of cautious optimism, but Daniel couldn't ignore the lingering tension in the air. Change, he realized, would come slowly, and it would require persistence. The following weeks saw Brookhaven begin to implement the reforms demanded by the community. Bias training sessions became mandatory, not just for officers, but for all city employees. The newly formed Civilian Oversight Board convened its first meeting, with Angela Brooks appointed as its chair. Transparency policies were enacted, ensuring that complaints against officers would be made public and thoroughly investigated. For many, these steps felt like progress, but for others, it was only the beginning of a much larger journey. For Daniel, life slowly began to return to something resembling normal. He returned to his job, spent more time with his family, and tried to find peace amidst the lingering media attention. But the events of that day had left an indelible mark on him. One afternoon, as he watched his son and daughter play in the yard, he found himself reflecting on how close he had come to losing everything. "I didn't think it could happen to me," he later confided to a friend, "but now I see how easily it can. And if it can happen to me, it can happen to anyone." His friend nodded, understanding the weight of Daniel's words. "That's why you're doing this," the friend replied. "Because someone has to." Meanwhile, Rick Carter's life had taken a drastically different turn. No longer a police officer, he struggled to find purpose and meaning outside of his uniform. His termination had not only cost him his career, but also many of his friendships and his standing in the community. For weeks, he avoided public places, fearing the glares and whispers that seemed to follow him wherever he went. But one day, Carter made a decision. He signed up to volunteer with a local community center that focused on bridging the gap between law enforcement and underserved neighborhoods. It wasn't easy. His presence was met with skepticism and outright hostility at first. "Why are you here?" one teenager asked him bluntly. Carter didn't have a perfect answer. "Because I want to learn," he said simply. Over time, Carter began to listen more than he spoke. He heard stories from people whose lives had been shaped by encounters with police, stories that echoed Daniel's experience, but often with far worse outcomes. These conversations forced Carter to confront the biases and assumptions that had defined his career. Slowly, he began to see himself not just as a former officer, but as someone with the potential to help others avoid the mistakes he had made. One evening, Carter attended a community forum where Daniel was scheduled to speak. It was the first time they had seen each other since their mediated meeting at the precinct. Carter sat in the back, unsure if he should approach Daniel afterward. But as the event ended, Daniel spotted him and made his way over. "Rick," Daniel said, his tone neutral but not unkind. Carter stood awkwardly, unsure of what to say. "I didn't expect to see you here," Daniel continued. Carter nodded. "I've been trying to understand," he admitted. "What happened that day? What I did? What I can do now?" Daniel studied him for a moment before speaking. "It's not about fixing the past," he said. "You can't. It's about what you do moving forward." Carter nodded, grateful for the honesty, but still uncertain about his path. "If you ever want to talk," Daniel added, "you know where to find me." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a step forward. In the months that followed, Daniel and Carter crossed paths several more times, often at events focused on community building and police reform. Their interactions remained formal but cordial, a testament to the possibility of growth and change even amidst lingering pain. Brookhaven itself began to transform. The Oversight Board uncovered and addressed several long-standing issues within the police department, leading to resignations, retraining efforts, and policy changes. Angela Brooks became a prominent figure in the region, advocating for similar reforms in neighboring towns. For Daniel, the most significant victory came when he was invited to speak at a national conference on policing and racial equity. Standing on a stage in front of thousands of people, he shared his story, not as a tale of victimhood, but as a call to action. "We all have a role to play in this fight," he said, his voice steady and strong. "Whether you're a community member, an officer, or someone watching from the sidelines, it's on all of us to make sure justice isn't just a word we say, but something we live every day." The audience rose to their feet, applauding as Daniel stepped away from the microphone. As the conference ended and Daniel walked off the stage, he felt a sense of closure he hadn't expected. The journey hadn't been easy, and it wasn't over, but for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful about the future. And for Rick Carter, who watched Daniel's speech from his small apartment, that hope sparked something in him as well. He turned off the television and sat in silence for a long time, thinking about the words he had heard. Then, with a deep breath, he opened his laptop and began typing an email to Daniel. Maybe, Carter thought, it's never too late to start doing the right thing.